Welcome, families, to another episode of Thriving Special Families. I'm your host, Crystal Sanford, and today our topic will be navigating the preschool transition from early intervention services, IFSPs, to IEPs. I'm so glad to have my guest today, Seth Schwartz of Brightside Law Group. Hello, Seth.
Hi, Crystal. Thank you so much for having me today.
Oh, thanks for being here. This is a great topic. I know lots of families have questions about that preschool transition, so we're so glad to have you here. Parents, if you are listening to our podcast, I would say welcome to the Thriving Special Families family. So happy to have you here with another episode. If you are watching us live, welcome. Thanks for being here. I have a hello here already. So thanks for being here. And I also want to give you information and a disclaimer that the information that is shared here is for your informational purposes only. If you are in need of medical or legal advice, we encourage you to please contact a professional in that area for information for your specific situation. If you're watching us live, feel free to add comments and we'll do our best to answer your questions along the way. Our topic is transitioning from the IFSP to the IEP. And I want to properly introduce my guest, Seth. Seth Schwartz, Esquire, is the managing attorney at Brightside Law Group. He helps families with children of all abilities to navigate their special education rights and with limited conservatorships. Brightside Law Group's approach is to provide objective and experienced legal counsel in a compassionate and understanding manner. Many families have never worked with an attorney before, and Brightside does their best to make the process as transparent and easy as possible. And I want to say that Seth is amazing at what he does in supporting families. And so parents, if you are in need in California, in need of an attorney, this may be a place for you to go to in interest of a consultation. But Seth, I'd love for you first just to share a little bit about your story. I think it's such a value for people and their story. So tell us a little bit about what led you to become an attorney.
Sure. And thank you. That was a very nice introduction. I appreciate that. So my name is Seth Schwartz, and I am a special education attorney, and I'm with Brightside Law Group. And I went to law school a little bit later than most people. I started in my very early 30s and started a firm in 2012. And sort of what led me there was when I was in law school, I worked for a gentleman named Thomas Nelson, also a special education attorney in San Diego. And I was interning at his office and sort of getting exposed to the field and some of the other people. Two of the people that really stood out was Andrea Katz and Yoshi Bauer. Both of them sort of introduced me to what autism is, which was a little bit surprising to me because my sister has autism. And I grew up seeing sort of my family deal with some of the pressures of raising my sister when things shifted a lot when I was 3 years old. At some point, my sister was in a group home. She had both regional center and an IEP at the school. And I didn't really think much of it. I struggled with school myself. I was sort of left to much of my own devices in many ways. And I wound up graduating 6 months late due to some of my own struggles. And my sister and I didn't really have that typical sister-brother relationship that you would anticipate having with a sibling. And so when I was going through this internship at Tom's office, I met people who were explaining what autism is and how it presents and manifests. And I was learning a lot through helping families and seeing a lot of similar things that I had experienced growing up that the families that we were working with were experiencing. And it shifted my entire direction. I had pursued music for years and years and years. And eventually I decided to go to law school because I felt like my path needed to change, but I still had music in the background. And that changed. During law school, I realized that special education was what I wanted to be doing. I knew I wanted to have my own office, and I began to think about it in law school and plan it. And I started an office out of law school, and it took about 6 or 8 months. I met my then partner, Matthew Story, who's also a practicing attorney in special education. And for almost 8.5 years, we ran Schwartz and Story together. And the pandemic obviously has changed a lot of lives, including mine. So I'm back with Brightside Law Group and doing the work that I really enjoy doing, helping families. And that's sort of the long and short of it.
Wow, it's amazing how life is just going to come full circle for you. Never really thinking that special education or supporting families like that was anywhere in your path, and you've kind of come right back around to that. And I'm sure because of your background, you're able to empower families and support them with a greater level of empathy.
I definitely tend to think that our approach is to talk to people as if they were part of our family or at least our friends and sort of unwind these issues, because by the time people come to an attorney, you're frustrated. You've lost trust. You don't know where to go. You probably have looked at some of the law and feel a little bit confused by it. And so I kind of see our view as to break it down a little bit, take a look at the issues that somebody is having, put it in the context of the law, and just be really honest about where they're at so that they can take a direction, whether it be the legal direction or working with somebody else, an advocate like yourself, or finding the services and supports they need.
Well, and I love that approach that you guys have, and that's why I'm so glad to have you here to answer some questions about our topic today. And that topic is the preschool transition. Where do you typically kind of start with families if they have a little one and they're coming to you with some struggles in those first IEPs?
So the first IEP, I think we want to know a lot about how they got to us. We want to understand what their concerns were, sort of what that developmental history was, what they're seeing. There's usually a trigger that it isn't necessarily the concern and where it started. So they'll come to us and they'll feel like this happened. But that's actually a series of events that led to where we are at today. And we're trying to unravel that story, because when we actually help a family, we're trying to put it back on track. And you can't do that necessarily unless you look historically. So to take this and look at it the IFSP route, which is the Individual Family Service Plan, it's a Part C intervention of the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And in Part C transitions at 3 years old, or 36 months, to Part B, and Part B is 3 to 22 years old. And the idea here is that early intervention is really important and very necessary, and that if we get in there from 0 to 3 and help children that are at risk or have a developmental delay, that we may even be able to avoid having to provide school-age services, because we can get ahead of these concerns. Mm-hmm. So typically, if I'm looking at the younger kids, I'm looking to see what happened in early intervention. How did they get over to regional center to start that conversation about an IFSP? And what happened when they tried to make that transition over to the school district? So very commonly, we'll hear that the services changed or that they were denied those services. So those are a lot of the things that we typically deal with. And we're going to want to know that background about how we got here and what information was on the table when they started discussing an IEP for the first time.
And what advice do you have for families, let's say, where the child is 30 months, 32 months, where they're getting ready to have their first IEP meeting? Are there some things that parents can do to maybe set themselves in a better place in preparation?
Well, certainly learning everything you can possibly learn about both the IFSP process and the IEP process is tantamount to success. You need to know basic things like what are your rights and what do these timelines look like, as well as understanding what the documents you're looking at are, so that you understand what the outcomes of an IFSP mean in relation to services and how that's going to transition to, say, goals when you have an IEP. You really need a lot of information. And I think one of the things that Crystal and I had spoken with before is, 3 things that would sort of impact the transition. And so the 3 things that I always had in my mind were timelines, because the IFSP timeline is something that the service coordinator needs to be aware of, where 3 months prior to 36 months or 3 years, up to 6 months beforehand. So there's a 3-month window. That IFSP coordinator is supposed to contact the local educational agency and start that process of getting those assessments going, because the goal is to have an IEP in place if it's necessary at the 3rd birthday. And that's important because you've got these timelines for an IFSP, But on the other side of the table, you have timelines for an IEP, which are very consistent with that 3 to 6 months. So the timelines for an IEP are 15 days to give the parent an assessment plan, with 15 days for the parent to consider consenting. And then the district has 60 days to carry that assessment out and determine eligibility, with 30 days then to plan for the actual IEP. So you could see very quickly that that time can stretch on, that 3 to 6 months to get an IEP in place. So what's unfortunate that sometimes happens is people are people, and some of these things get missed. And so why is it important to know the law? Well, it's important to know things like the timelines that are in law, so that you can sort of get ahead of these questions and make sure that people are going the right direction when you need to pursue something. So understanding things like timelines are super important. But the other thing is preparing and documenting. Once you know what you're going to do and when you're going to do it, you also kind of have to know how to prepare for that. And so you're going to be getting assessments done at the school district. And to do that, they really don't know that your son or daughter, they haven't met yet. They haven't been in school. You're going to have documents from doctors and therapists and your IFSPs that have outcomes. But the outcomes that they've chosen for development are different than they would choose for, say, an IEP for educational purposes. So the things that parents should be thinking about when they're in that 0 to 3 program is, how do I get organized? How do I document everything? And so essentially your preparation for everything that comes next starts with organization, documenting, and then giving those documents to the school when you show up. So that means that you meet the psychologist for the first time, and that psychologist is not going to be aware of all the information that you've done, all the different tests that have happened, all the different therapists you've worked with, and you want to give them as much as possible. I often refer to that as setting them up for success. You know, you want to give them every opportunity to do those assessments the best they can. And those are tricky assessments, because sometimes they bring the kids to the school and they put them in small groups for 30 minutes. And then, you know, everybody walks away and the assessment comes back. And a lot of times the parents feel like they saw a different kid. And they don't understand that. So you're trying to give that picture that you have, along with documentation that supports that. So it's clear what they're dealing with in terms of what they have to get ahead of and determine eligibility.
And that's so great what you said there about setting them up for success. I know sometimes parents would say that they're hesitant to share their information or previous assessments and data with the school-based team. They want to let the team develop and do their own work. But you're saying that it's better to share that information, especially in this case.
I often liken things to some ridiculous analogies, but one of them would be a doctor's office. You may have gone to a doctor and got a diagnosis. It's unlikely that you would walk into the next doctor and not share that information. And in fact, if you didn't share that information, or at least the manifestations of what you're feeling, that doctor would not be able to give you a clear diagnosis. So I often think, why would you give things to the school? Well, their obligation is to figure out how to plan for your child. And if you have a lot of information that they don't have access to, you should be giving them everything. For better or worse, it's better to get ahead of the conversation than be presenting things later to try to show why they maybe didn't get the right information.
That's so true. You know, and sometimes when I'm working with families, and for example, we're looking at an IEE, or we're just, if we're working with a team that they're having some difficulty with, I will tell the parents, you know what, talk to your private speech therapist or your private OT, whoever is supporting your child privately, and just have them write a paragraph, just some observations about where the child is, what the skills are, what their recommendations are, and share that with the team, because often they get a different perspective. They see the child in different contexts, and that information can be really helpful in supporting, you know, your case and giving them insight that they don't get in the school environment.
And I think the transition from an IFSP to an IEP is a little bit different in that there's a complete absence of knowledge for the school. Whereas, you know, when a child is 10 or 11, they've been in school for a while, there's a lot of background information. And I will point out that some of our older kids, when parents leave these assessments off the table, sometimes that comes back to bite them. The school gets to act on what they know about, and they're supposed to act on what they should know about. And if something isn't that clear, that the parent maybe went out and got an assessment for that specific thing because they had an itch to get more information. Well, that's the kind of information that school might not need to know about unless they're made aware of it. So it's always important to give that information to the school.
Oh, that's great. That's really great information, parents. So I hope you're writing these things down because that's really important. And if you're just joining us, welcome again to another episode of Thriving Special Families. I'm your host, Crystal Sanford, and our topic today is navigating the IFSP to IEP preschool transition. Also know that our show is sponsored by Sanford Autism Consulting, where we provide advocacy and hope along your IEP journey. And our guest here today is Seth Schwartz of Brightside Law Group, and he's giving us some wonderful tips. First of all, we talked about knowing who your child is and knowing the timelines when it comes to that transition. And so that 6 months at least before they turn 3 is really a pivotal time where the school district needs to be acting, your service coordinator and that team needs to be acting, hopefully in tandem, so that by the time your child turns 3, they're in a good place to start strong with that IEP in place. So Seth, something else that you mentioned, and I've seen this happen in several clients that I've worked with, is that at that initial IEP meeting, the child is found to be not eligible for services.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for parents in those cases?
Well, I think, the initial problem that we have is just the surprise. My child has an IFSP and I show up and they tell me, I'm sorry, but your child doesn't qualify for an IEP. Yeah. And the first thing that you need to know is that the standards are different. I think that's the piece that, understanding the law gives you a background for, but being a parent, you just presume that the services are going to continue. Mm-hmm. Additionally, in addition to the eligibility category being different, or the way that we get to eligibility, we're also talking about education now, not just life in general. And I was thinking a lot about this because, Crystal, you proposed this question to me about things to look out for. And the one thing I want to mention is that an IEP is an educational-based document with 13 categories, and we look at the age of the child from 3 to 22, one of those categories of the 13, and then we look at the impact on education, which the impact on education is not merely academics. It could be behavioral, that takes away from the ability to access education. Even though our child is really smart and can do all the work, they just don't, because something gets in the way and they're unable to do that. Their disability is coming out and they're maybe not attending, or maybe their behaviors are getting in the way. So we look at eligibility different. Whereas like for an IFSP, we're looking at, do we have a developmental delay? How profound is it? And then we're looking at, are we at risk of a developmental delay, which is even less than having one? We're just at risk, and is there a high likelihood of a developmental delay is another standard that we look at. So we're looking at, it could be a disability, not that it necessarily is. And so if you're more on the could be a disability side, but getting early intervention, you're less likely to be eligible for an IEP when you approach the school for the first time. And that's actually kind of similar to another problem we see, which may help explain it even further, which is regional center does IPPs, individualized persons plans, individual persons plan. And those IPP also have a different eligibility criteria. So you could be at regional center with an IFSP and then not transfer to an IPP or get an IEP at the school district level.
Yes. Oh, thank you for pointing that out, because that is so true. That transition once they turn 3 is a totally different department within regional center, right? Yeah.
But the one nice thing about the school district side of things when you deal with eligibility is if you have questions and don't feel like the school captured your child's profile well, and you're looking at that report and maybe things seem factually incorrect, you do have the right to request that the school conduct an IEE, which is an individualized education evaluation. And that IEE is something that the school district would need to fund and hire somebody that's outside of the school district to do that IEE that the parent gets to pick, or they actually have to file for due process, which is a time-consuming task, and to show that their assessment is correct, and that way avoid paying for that IEE. And so what this gives the parents, which is unique to education, is an opportunity to say, I don't think you did this correctly, and I need another opinion. And then you can take that opinion back to the IEP team and rediscuss eligibility. So understanding your special education rights is very powerful, even when kids are 3 years old.
And that's great because that's how you started, was that understanding your rights is so important. And this is one of the reasons why is knowing what you have opportunity to access when it comes to your child. So we've talked about, knowing timelines when your child is under 3, as well as understanding the evaluation process, possibly asking for an IEE if necessary to get that second opinion. And so, what other tips do you have for parents who are in the midst of navigating this transition into an IEP?
Well, I think one of the things that I've always told parents to do is start an email for your child. And I know that this is a very simple thing, but it's not always obvious why it's so important. When you email from your child's account, you're going to be emailing the team for the IFSP and for the IEP and other services, and you'll be able to quickly find things, but you're also going to be encouraged to put things in writing. Thanks for having that conversation with me. This is what I took away from that. Here's a copy of the assessment plan you asked me to sign, and now you have both a copy in your email that's attached along with any dialogue that's going on. Teachers may send you information that's very useful for eligibility. For instance, I had a really tough time with your son or daughter today. They were doing X, Y, and Z at school. That information is not going to be in your IEP. So that's very important. And I did say preparing and documenting is super important to start early. If I could encourage anybody to do anything before even understanding the law, I would say that, start writing things down. Don't let anything go unwritten. You never know what you're going to need to show somebody, and you never know what history you're going to have to piece together. And the things that don't get written down are very easy to forget.
And I can imagine that would make, if necessary, if a parent does need to reach out to an advocate or attorney, that's going to make life a whole lot easier if they have been starting to track this trail and document everything.
It could make it easier for sure to find the information. It can make it harder for your professional to get it all together, but we're always here and we appreciate that. So
yes, for sure. Yeah, definitely. I love that idea about the separate email account because, I always tell parents the same thing. You got to document, and, if it's not written down, it never happened. Really, you don't have any proof. And so to have it in a separate email account could make it much easier to keep track of. So that's great advice.
And I jokingly say Google's not going anywhere, so Gmail is a pretty solid platform.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree for sure. And so, Seth, tell us about, are there any cases or any success stories that you've had in working with preschool families?
Sure. I think the one thing that stood out when I thought about this question was sort of the least restrictive environment question that comes a lot.
Yes.
Kids that are coming from an IFSP, which is delivering services at home or usually at a clinic, haven't experienced the school-based programs yet. And in preschool, there's just less general education options because school's not required until 6 years old. So as a result, we see a lot of offers for special day classes for children who, in a lot of cases, were already in some kind of general education preschool with some supports. So going back to preparing and documenting, what kind of documents would you want to give to your school? Well, documents about interactions with other kids that are typically developing, even if it's sisters or brothers. It could be interactions at a church group, or it could be a more traditional preschool. This information is very important for schools because it's very hard for them to tell how the student's going to do with typically developing peers. Right. There's a mandate in special education law that we want to educate students in their least restrictive environment or with kids that are typically developing so that they can have positive models for certain behaviors and academics and so forth. And I think that's really important because it's hard for a school district to sort of do two things. One, deviate from programs that they have space in. So they may be thinking, well, where are we going to offer this child to be? And also to give them enough information that they understand that a student will be successful on the things they're working on if they're placed in these type of placements. So preparing for that conversation is super important. Some of my best success stories have been our office helping families get into less restrictive environments instead of going into a moderate, severe special day class, to actually get them a space at a Head Start program with services and supports coming into it. Or in some cases, when the school district can't provide it, even a private school that preschool.
That is exactly what is happening in several cases that I'm working with right now, is that teams are proposing this is the environment for your child just because that's the precedence. That's what they always do with kids who are preschool, who have an IEP, versus what is really FAPE for that child.
Yeah.
So I love that you've been able to be successful in helping kids access the least restrictive environment.
The other thing that came to mind when I was thinking about this is really what a lot of families are dealing with now. And so this is partially a conversation about, having some patience and understanding the problem exists, as well as, knowing when to get help. At the beginning of the pandemic, roughly March of 2020, around the 13th or 16th, the schools all closed down. That included assessments. SB 117, which is a bill that was in California, said if you didn't have consent on an assessment plan to get started, you didn't actually need to go out and get that consent. Therefore, you don't need to do assessments. This left a lot of our potential preschool kids in sort of a limbo between being cut off at 3 years old and getting services beyond that until the schools reopen. So we already had sort of a backlog in preschool assessments to begin with. This is a long time before COVID, but now we have this, you don't need to assess if you don't have consent, you don't need to go get it. And what happened in June was DDS provided a waiver of the cutoff at 3 years old. So now if you turn 3 during COVID and can't get services at the school district and they won't assess, the regional center through an IFSP can still provide services, and that waiver is current right now. With that said, I will say that one of the other directives is that they actually have to go and work towards getting those services started at the school. And most schools now are doing some form of assessments. It's hit and miss if it's going to be in person, but they are starting to happen, and schools are starting to reopen in a hybrid fashion. So this is less of a problem, but the backlog of assessments is still a real problem. And if you're knocking on that door and they're saying no, talk to an advocate, talk to the people at the school district that you're dealing with, and ask them about their timelines and what they expect. And if you find that that's something you can wait for, great. If you don't, there are options. You can get help.
That's so good to know, because I know that was another big issue. And parents, if you have any final questions for Seth, please let us know. Feel free to add those to the comments. But I know that was a big issue for parents who really felt as though they were in that limbo and didn't really know where to turn, and are maybe just now getting into a place where they're getting their IEP months and months, later than they had expected. So I'm sure there's tons of parents with questions.
Well, we're always here. If anybody has any questions, they're more than welcome to contact us. Always happy. You don't have to have a case. You just have to have a question.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, parents, our topic today has been navigating that transition from IFSP to IEP. And I really appreciate Seth. He's given us such great words of wisdom, as he's talked about, documentation, knowing what you need to have so far as tests and things that have been done, sharing that and preparing to even share that. Maybe even getting a separate email with your child's information so that you're using that specifically to share back and forth with your team. That's awesome. Also, knowing the timelines so that you're making that smooth transition by the time they're age 3. And also knowing about the least restrictive environment and gathering that evidence that shows how your child has been able to navigate the least restrictive environment in any context. I love that. It could be church, it could be preschool, it could be, siblings, that's great. So we had one comment. Thank you to Shannon Michelle. She says that we're awesome and thanks for our work. So thank you, Shannon. And then also we had another thank you from Maggie. So we're so happy that parents are watching and getting some good information to help with their child's transition. Parents, if you have questions for Seth, I think Seth can share his information there.
Sure. Well, if you're on Facebook right now, it's facebook.com/Brightside Law Group. Feel free to like us or follow us, and you'll get updates about some of the speaking. And Crystal was just on an advocacy panel a couple weeks back. We do as much as we can to let people know about their rights and get information about what's going on in our community. You can also feel free to give me an email. My personal email is Seth, S-E-T-H, @brightsidelawgroup.com, or you can give us a quick call, 858-939-0380. We'd be happy to hear from you.
That's awesome. And parents, if you have other questions that you would like to send to me as well, you can always find me at sdautismhelp.com. That's like San Diego, autismhelp.com. You can also send a message via email if you would like to, in regards to our show today, at thrivingspecialfamilies@gmail.com. Or you can always give a call at 619-403-9097. So again, this has been another episode of Thriving Special Families. I'm your host, Crystal Sanford. We've had an awesome special guest, Seth Schwartz. Thank you again, Seth, so much.
Thank you, Crystal. It was a pleasure.
And families, always remember that you are going to be okay and your child's going to be okay. Have a great day, families.